All right, so let's just go ahead and get started for this webinar. It's the last of the webinar series that was supposed to be ending for the month of September. But this one extended into October for today and tomorrow. So I'll be releasing some new webinars maybe sometime next week for the month of October. But some of those are going to feature continuing from the first webinars, like the research process, which I promised students I would continue after generating ideas, and what do you do after that. So I'll hit those areas. I'll go a little bit more into thesis statements in those future webinars. Yeah, so first of all, you guys all know me by now. My name is Quanah Yazzie. I am originally from Rock Point, Arizona. I now currently work here at Saley as a professional writing tutor. Yeah, I specialize in writing and English, but I also tutor in other subject areas, including Navajo language and Native American study courses, some math courses. So if you need, we're pretty much subject-based tutors. So all of tutors here at the Learning Center, they're experienced in several courses, which they're able to tutor in specifically. So we call ourselves subject-based tutors for that reason. So today I'm actually going to go over, proofreading and editing specifically, and how to. A lot of information I'm giving today is specifically targeted for English 101 and 102 students, and a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is, just giving you some tips and techniques in areas that you can actually, areas that you can actually edit and proofread yourselves at home when, so you don't have to. It's sort of like going into the process of writing and the stages of writing, and those editing and proofreading portions, those are going to help you at home to sort of learn how to proofread your papers on your own. And then after you've done that, you can come to a tutor so that we can help you even further, try to take from today's webinar, try to incorporate what you learned into your work, try to proofread it, and then come to a tutor. And then we can further help you and discuss some of those things that, some of those connections that you're not currently making. And that's the goal of this session, is for you to point out some of those things that you can jot down. You can jot down throughout this webinar, some of the phrases, some of the terms, some of those concepts specifically within proofreading and editing, and just go from there. So I encourage you to take notes as much as you can, and try to go on your own time, research some of those terms and what they actually mean specifically in grammar and stuff like that. So, we do have a Q&A before we start, a Q&A feature. It should be at the very bottom of your screen. So feel free to ask questions throughout this webinar. I should be able to pause for a bit and then answer those questions as they come. And there's also a chat box feature that you guys can utilize as well. I'll be keeping them both open. And then I don't know if you guys can see Deanna on the other screen. She had to give me access to this webinar version of Zoom. So everyone as attendees, you actually can't see who's participating in this webinar except the host. Yeah, so that's it. I'll go ahead and get started. So let's go right into it. Let's see here. If it will work. Let's try this again. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Let's see, let me open my chat box and Q&A here on the side. For some reason, it automatically just eliminates all the windows once you share your screen. So, all right, so again, we're going to be diving into some parts of proofreading and editing. And first I wanted to start off by asking you, did you know that there is actually a difference between all of those words here that are listed? You have revising, you have editing, and then you have proofreading. So between all of these three, they actually have different meanings, and they're actually different processes of writing. They're stages of writing that these words are incorporated to. And when we go into all of these three meanings here, we'll start with revising. I'll go into the definitions, and then we'll go from there and build into our agenda. So with revising, first of all, we have this word, and this is where within the stages of writing, the revising portion, this is the definition of revising. So here's when you revise, you attend to large-scale persuasive aspects of text. So here you're actually focusing on organization and style. So this is where you're actually developing your paper itself. So after you generated ideas, now you're actually putting your paper into this structure. And that's what revising is. You're actually, after you completed your draft, now you're actually going to go into revising those portions and how everything is structured. And the second one is editing. And editing is a little bit deeper into revising. Here, you're actually focusing on grammar. So we have our structure, right? Our structure of our essay. So now if we're saying we're editing, within editing, we're looking at the smaller things. We're dissecting those paragraphs and looking at sentence structures. We're looking at verb tenses, what's the tone and mood of this essay, and everything dealing with grammar. That's what editing is. And that's a process of writing, a stage of writing after revisions. So when we're starting our essay, right, we have, brainstorming, we generate ideas, we come up with our thesis, and then so forth. We come up with our first draft. From after the first draft, we hit that revising. Now we go into editing. And then the third one is proofreading. And here, proofreading is even smaller. This is very specific into those, the spelling and the punctuation and those other mechanics within writing. So this is where you see typos and punctuation marks are not being used correctly and things like that. So when we look at this proofreading stage, this is actually the very last thing that we should actually be focusing on. And that's actually a tip in writing specifically. So after we've got our essay completely done, we don't want to just jump into proofreading. We do this while we're actually, editing our paper. We tend to fix typos and stuff like that. But as a tip, this should actually be the very last thing before you even turn in your paper to do proofreading, looking at the spelling, punctuation, and stuff like that. So when we look at this structure here, these three, revising, editing, proofreading tips, we're going to focus into revision first, focusing on organization and style. And we're going to look at what areas that you can look upon within those concepts and how to, begin revising your paper. Same thing with editing. We'll look at some grammar techniques and grammar tips, and then proofreading. That one we're not going to really cover because it's pretty basic spelling and punctuation. So we're not going to really dive into proofreading today. Mainly, the main things I wanted to focus on was revising and editing. So when we're going to focus on revising and editing, this is after we have our full draft of our paper, right? We've already written it out and stuff like that. So a tip that we can actually do to start revising the organizational thing is to look back at essay structures. So when we look at essay structures, there is different types of essay structures within writing, depending on what you're actually writing about. And here I'm actually just going to show you an example of a basic five paragraph essay. And within a 5-paragraph essay or any type of essay, we always have to include an introduction, body of work, and conclusion. So you see here, those three concepts, those three elements there are part of essay structures, and they're in that same order. So when we're actually looking at an introduction, we have to start looking to see if we have a hook sentence, and if we have a background or summary, and a thesis statement. And these three things should always be involved within the introduction as a basic general 5-paragraph essay. Sometimes the thesis statement is actually implied, and the thesis statement can be implied throughout the entire essay in some cases. But the only thing we need to focus on is if we have these three things within an introduction for us to have, a very well organized essay. And within the body of work, we have to separate our paragraphs into these three things here. And our body of work can be as many paragraphs as we want, as long if it's related to this thesis statement up here. So this is a structure of a paragraph, one paragraph here. You have your topic sentence, which directly relates to the thesis statement. We have supporting details that relate to thesis statement and the topic sentence. And then we have a transition sentence that transitions into the next paragraph. So this here can be repeated so many times for each paragraph. And that's, again, the basic structure of an essay, depending on how much supporting details you have to support this thesis statement here. So then moving into the conclusion, after we've got all of this stuff here, this is where we're actually wrapping up everything. We're reinstating the thesis statement. We're reinstating all of this supporting details, sort of like as a summary. And then we're adding a conclusion sentence. And within the conclusion sentence, we're actually, this is where, depending on the essay style, this is where we can do stuff like call to action, or, some solutions that we have, your final argument, your final stance on this issue, if it's, argumentative or anything in that case. This is the basic structure of how an essay should be. And if at any point your instructor already have a format for you, you should always follow your instructor's format, because this is just a basic 5-paragraph essay. But some instructors will change some of the stuff, for their assignments. And the most important thing when we're looking at revising is to go off of this structure, see if everything is in order before we even move on to those little things. And the number one thing that we should focus on is that thesis statement. And if you were at my last webinar, we went through how to construct thesis statements. We have a thesis statement involving, a topic with the controlling idea with evidentiary support attached to it. All of that together within a sentence is what a thesis statement is. And once we have that thesis statement, that's what we're going to be focusing on entirely throughout this whole essay. That's what that's why this here is important when we're going to begin revising our papers. So make sure you have a thesis statement which is stated or implied, and then make sure everything you're talking about is completely focused on that thesis statement. So that's the number one thing that I see when students approach me with their essays. I always jump to this first. I look at structuring, because this is the number one thing here at the Net College that we focus on. Writing instructors here, they focus on structure rather than going into punctuation, grammar, and stuff like that. So this is the key to writing your essays, is the structuring. So the next portion we're going to is styling. And here, I'm using style in the way of, writing style, specifically your assignments that you get here at the Net College. We tend to run into, the basic, the thought pattern, paragraph pattern, essays like narrative, writing, descriptive, all of the stuff you see on the screen. Cause and effect, process, persuasive, definition, compare and contrast, and so forth. So these are the type of style, depending on your style of what you're writing about. There's a lot of them have different structures, and it's really a lot to go into when we're talking in terms of revision, because some of them like in the case of argumentative, we have to prove some points, right? And our style has to be, it can be within the 5-paragraph essay, that same outline, but our supporting details have to fit our argument, stuff like that. This is where it gets kind of really broad, because I can't really go into style specifically. There's not really a set format or set pattern for every single style of writing. But with these ones here, we also have other things like reflection, profile essays, critical essays, literature essays. All of this stuff here have their own requirements. And that's the thing that I wanted to stress, is that I can't really actually go into all of this stuff really one by one. But if you need more questions about some of these things, you can actually just come see me, and we can have a discussion into some of those writing styles that you see on the screen. And lastly, some styles of writing, when we start attaching stuff to these here that you see on the screen, these tend to run into like, literary analysis, argumentative research. We attach research to argumentative, which makes this argumentative research. And same thing here, rhetorical analysis and stuff like that. So there's a bunch of styles of writing out there, but again, I can't actually go into each of these styles of writing to figure out a set structure for each one. Because like descriptive, we have to use a lot of descriptive language. We're looking at our senses, our 5 senses, our touch, smell, and so forth. Persuasive, we have to use persuasive language. Compare and contrast, is there something being compared and what's different, what's the same? So all of these have their own different style. So I'll just use one as an example, and I'll use rhetorical analysis. And for rhetorical analysis, this is sort of breaking down the style. This is the style of rhetorical analysis, just as an example. So rhetorical analysis, the way we get the word rhetorical, rhetoric actually means the study of, words and language, the study of word and language specifically by writers and so forth. And then if we add analysis, we're actually now analyzing the study of words and the language used by writers and speakers and artists and stuff like that. And a requirement for rhetorical analysis, one of the not a requirement, but a really a suggestion that can be made with writing a rhetorical analysis is using what we call a rhetorical triangle. And again, this is just one style of writing, which is rhetorical analysis. Each style actually has their own. So I'm just using this as an example. So if you want, you can actually research some of those styles of writing to see a set style or some tips and tricks like this rhetorical triangle for this rhetorical analysis. So a rhetorical triangle is actually the art of persuasive speech used by writers, speakers, and artists, and so forth. So if you remember, a rhetorical triangle actually involves these 3 things here. You have ethos, pathos, logos. And ethos is the appeal to credibility. And then pathos is the appeal to emotion. And logos is the appeal to logic. So if we were to start looking at our organization or in our style of this essay we're writing, if we have this, we want to make sure we have these 3 things within our essay. So an example can be asking yourself, how's the author influencing an audience using credibility? Same thing with pathos, how are they influencing an audience using emotion, and how are they influencing audience using logic? So are these 3 things involved within your essay itself to fit this, to have this within your essay, to make this a rhetorical analysis? And this is diving into style. So we have to look at, the requirements of each style in order to move on into, editing and proofreading. We have to get the set organization and how you're putting things together, and the set style and so forth. So then after, that's the only things I want to talk about within revision itself. was the essay structures and sort of elaborating more on the style itself. So then when we go into editing, this is where we start to dive into all of those little tiny things. After we have the structure for us, we're looking at, verb tenses, sentence structures, specifically how we're putting sentences together. Do we have run-on sentences? Do we have all of that stuff there? Dealing with sentences basically within grammar. And there is some tips that I'm going to show you that you should jot down as well, just to keep in mind when you're revising or editing. In this case, number 2 is editing. And within editing, one thing to note, after you have your essay written out, you got your structure down, now we're going to editing. One thing to look at is how you're using verb tenses within your paper itself. So within verb tenses, we have verb tenses that are consistent and some that are complex. And the difference between those, that consistency is just using verbs within your essay. Make sure they're actually all past tense, make sure they're all present tense, or make sure they're all in future tense in any way that you want, but make sure they're all consistent on the same level. And here's an example of that here. So in this example I have with consistent, in Collett's novel, Sherry and the Last Sherry, and the character Leia works hard to appear and act young at the start. By the end, she is gray-haired and stout. So here, if we look at this, the consistency here is that this is in, I believe, present tense, right? Because our verbs within this paragraph here are works and is. So these are both in present tense. So this makes this consistent. And I do run into a lot of students that mix and match a lot of those verb tenses. And when they do that, it's actually called it's complex in some in some instances. But in some instances, when you're using complex, you have to be very careful in how you're using some of those verb tenses, because when you look at here, this is a complex verb tense, and we're actually mix and matching our verb tenses within this paragraph here. So here we have, for parents who worry, which is present tense, that their children will never eat. This is in future tense. Anything. A new study offers some relief. Researchers examine past tense, the eating habit of 5,390 pairs of twins, and found in past tense, children's aversions to trying new foods are mostly inherited. So the tip with this, when you're going to mix and match verb tenses, try to identify the shifts specifically. So here, when you're doing your shifts, when you're editing, try to look for those shifts within the story itself. So here, when we're actually writing up to maybe this point here, up to researchers, from this point, we're introducing a new shift of the story, a new shift into the past. So that's why we change all of our verb tenses to past tense. So here we're introducing, a research that we're sourcing. So researchers examined the eating habits of so forth and found children's aversions. So this whole portion here, this is in a past tense because it's happened already in the past, but we're introducing it into our current time, which is here, of us talking in present tense. So you have to identify some of those areas where, those shifts are happening within the story in order for you to use verb tenses that are complex in different different forms of, present, past, and future tense. So some tips with this portion here with complex, if you find something that doesn't sound right within verb tenses specifically, there is ways that you can fix them, and ways that you can do that is adding words and time expressions that fit the current time of the story that's happening. Just like here, they're introducing that a new study offers some relief, and now they're introducing it here as a past research about how it has been done. So let's just make sure that we're either consistent or properly using verb tenses, complex verb tenses. So what I suggest with my students, when I get new students, I always try to have them write consistently first before we move into using complex verb tenses and so forth. So then the next one I wanted to talk about is style and voice. And this is sort of, it might sound the same as, you know, the revision portion with organization and style, but here we're talking in terms of grammar. And within grammar specifically, what we're talking about style and voice is we're talking about three things I wanted to add here that I wanted to elaborate on is direct discourse versus indirect discourse. And it's basically just being direct versus indirect when you're actually quoting someone, how you're actually talking to someone. And the next one I'm going to go into is formal versus informal language, and then active voice versus passive voice. So the first one, direct discourse versus indirect discourse. Here we have direct, right? And then we have indirect. And here are two examples that you'll see here on both direct and indirect. So here, when we run across something like this, we're specifically talking about the language, the voice of how you're introducing a quote specifically. And here with direct on the left, we're saying we're introducing the quote, "Are you going to the store without me? Harriet's sister wanted to know." Here on the right, we're saying Harriet's sister wanted to know if we were going to the store without her. The difference between these two is how we're actually introducing the quote and who's talking within the story or the writing specifically. And we want to actually stay consistent with either using direct voice or indirect voice when we're introducing quotes themselves. We're not actually focusing on how to use, how to introduce quotes, like in terms of punctuation stuff. That's not what we're talking here. We're talking about the actual voice of how to introduce, you know, quotes within a story. So as you can see, the direct side is more, you know, it's sort of like active voice. We're actually talking. And on this side, we're sort of just being more passive. We'll go into the difference between active and passive voice. And in some cases, you'll see mixed between direct and direct discourse and indirect. And here, if we see something like this, for instance, this is actually wrong. We cannot actually mix and match direct voice versus indirect voice because it's actually a grammar issue. So if you were to look at this sentence at the bottom, we see Harriet's sister wanted to know. This is a direct. This is an indirect, right? This is an indirect discourse here. But then on the right here, are we going to the store without her? This is actually a quote that she's saying here. So it's sort of like we're using both indirect and we're using direct quoting here. So we're sort of mixing and matching. The only way this is sort of wrong is because we don't have quotes or anything like that. We have to have those quotes in order for this to be more, just for it to be more grammatically correct. But we cannot mix and match those direct quoting and indirect voice. And the next one is formal versus informal. This is where we're looking at formal as, being more professional, being more polite and sort of in that way, not necessarily informal where we're not being formal, we're not polite, we're not being professional and things like that. So it's sort of like having this etiquette on the left side. And you'll see these two examples here again, and try to read through both of them. I'll give you some time to read through both of them just to see the difference between formal voice versus informal voice. One is more, polite, one is more professional, rather than the other one where we're sort of, we're opposite of formal specifically. So I'll give you time to read that. So as you can see, when you read the left one, we're sort of, everything's more short, right? It's sort of a little bit tiny bit summarized. And then the right one is sort of more lengthy, and we're using other language rather than being more professional. We're using words like, whisper and shriek. We're using, disabuse anyone of the misimpression that the saxophone is limited to that can sound you heard during bad television credits, and so forth. So I hope you guys get the difference between formal and informal. And again, if we see it mixed, again, let's see. If you see any sentences that are mixed between formal and informal, we actually cannot do that as well grammatically. So here on the one that's being underlined, this is the formal voice here. And then after that portion is actually the informal portion. So we're sort of mix and matching our voice, which sort of confuses reader of how you actually feel about, a certain topic and so forth. So we have formal, then we have informal here on the right. And then the last one, this one I get a lot of questions from students a lot about is difference between active voice versus passive voice. And within active voice and passive voice, I'll sort of explain these two sentences here. So we have, for active voice specifically, we have chipmunks adore piñons. And what the difference between active versus passive voice is how the subject is, how the subject is involved within the sentence itself. So if you were to look at the active voice sentence, we have this chipmunk here. This is our subject. I'll put S. And then we have our verb or our predicate. I'll just put our predicate for now. And a predicate is actually, what the subject's actually doing, the action, phrases, the action that's happening that the subject is doing. And in this case, when we're talking in active voice, the subject here, the chipmunk, is actually doing the action, adore. So the chipmunk's adoring piñons. That makes this active voice. But here on passive voice, we have our subject here on the back, and then we have our predicate here. And what this does with passive voice is that the subject is actually being acted upon the verb. So here, piñons are adored by chipmunks. And this may seem a little confusing, but the active voice is more the subject is doing the action, and the passive voice is more the the subject just being there and they're taking the action towards them. So that's the difference between those two specifically. And in some cases, we, again, if we're seeing mix match in these two things, just in this case, say Key fed the chipmunk piñons, even though it had been fed earlier by Ba. And here we're actually mixing active versus passive voice. Here we have active voice because Key is feeding the chipmunk. And then here we have Ba at the end, subject, and her predicate is here, have been fed earlier. So the predicate is acting upon the subject itself. So when we see that, this is actually what we cannot do as well. It's mix and match active versus passive voice. And in some cases, this is where we get into, why we need to talk in active versus passive voice. Active voice is actually used within regular literature writing, so like narrative writing, descriptive writing, and so forth, rather than passive voice is where it's mostly majority used in research and scientific and technical writing and stuff like that. And the reason why we use passive voice within those types of writing, like scientific and research, is because it seems more fact-based and it's more professional in the research way. And you'll see an example here. I already did this portion. So if I were to talk in passive voice here, this is an example from if you were doing research. So a new experimental liver transplant option was discovered. And this is passive here because of that there. It was just discovered. And this one actually doesn't have, oops. And let's go look at the top one here at the top. This is supposed to say by surgeons. I just saw that just now because this is our subject. So if we're comparing those two, passive to active voice within research writing, the top one is more active, saying surgeons discovered a new experimental liver transplant operation. So it's sort of happening in the current moment in present tense, sort of in the voice itself. And within passive, if we read a new experimental liver transplant operation was discovered by surgeons, we're using passive voice. And it just sounds more professional in a way because it sounds like it's an actual fact. And if we mix and match those two, it won't actually work together. So when we're doing research, scientific writing, we have to use passive voice so that we're sort of, making it more fact-based and we're eliminating. And that's why I didn't actually have the surgeon here, is because we're eliminating who's performing the action, because we want to, it's a way to avoid naming someone within a sort of research and stuff like that. So that's why I actually didn't have by surgeons there. And that actually still makes it passive voice there. And I hope I didn't confuse anyone with that portion there, but there is a difference between, using active voice versus passive voice within certain writing. An example could be, I had a student within narrative writing, and they were using passive voice within their essay itself. And a lot of it was not so amusing when we're reading through it. There's a lot of, passive voice actually has a lot of these, had been or had discovered and stuff like that. There's a lot of these words here, and students can actually write a lot within passive voice, but it's uninteresting in a way. So that's why when we're doing literature writing or regular writing, we have to use that active voice. And then within research, specifically, we use passive voice. All right. So then moving on into the next one, we're going to hit those sentence structures. And this is where this is where it gets even more complex when you're starting to edit your sentences and stuff like that. And within sentence structures specifically, we're going to hit these portions here. We're going to go into independent clauses, dependent clauses, simple sentences, compound sentences, complex sentences, and compound complex sentences. These are actually all related to one another. So I'm going to dissect, where you can find those, those run-ons and so forth within your essay itself. So then in order to understand what simple sentences, compound, complex, and so forth, those last four, we have to know what an independent clause is and a dependent clause. So here, an independent clause, if you were to just think about the word independent and attach clause to it, it basically just means something that, something that's independent. It can stand alone, right? It can be on its own. So if we were to keep that in our mind, the meaning of independent, attach it to this formula here, which is the formula for an independent clause. It's a subject plus a predicate. So a subject has to actually do an action for this to be an independent clause. So an example could be here. So the cell was large and unevenly shaped. And we have another one, Adriana bikes. So here, when we're looking at these two things, when we separate it with subject versus predicate, you see the yellow is where the subjects are. So the cell is the subject, and predicate was large and unevenly shaped. Same thing with the bottom. So predicates can actually be, it's just basically an action done by the subject. And they can be adjectives in the case of the first one, which is the cell was large and unevenly shaped. We're describing the subject. And the second one is a verb. So Adriana is biking. So the bike is the action, the verb for these sentences. And When we look at dependent clause itself, opposite, if we were to think about the word dependent, it's just something that is dependent. It cannot stand alone. And this will get relevant in a bit here. Why I'm saying, why are we thinking about why independent can stand alone, why can't dependent cannot stand alone, so forth. So if we're looking at dependent clauses as an example, was large in the lonely night. So here, if we were to highlight it with this formula at the top, was large in the lonely night is actually just the predicate. We actually don't have a subject attached to it. And when we see something like this, we have no subject within a sentence specifically. This is actually a fragment and it's not a sentence at all. But when you see independent clauses with a subject and a predicate, this is actually the same thing as just a simple sentence. It's basically a sentence is what an independent clause is. And dependent clauses opposite. They're not sentences. They can't stand alone is what I'm trying to get at. So here, independent clauses can be alone. They're actual sentences. Here, they're not. Dependent clauses are not. So knowing the difference between independent clause and independent clause, we can now shift into identifying sentences within our essay and what's, look at things like compound sentences, complex sentences, and complex compound sentences, because each of these actually they're the same as their formulas again. So compound sentences are actually two independent clauses together, so two complete sentences attached together. And then we have complex with an independent clause, a complete sentence with an incomplete sentence to make this a complete sentence. And then the last one is a combination of independent clause plus dependent clause plus another independent clause. So by adding independent clauses to dependent clauses, you make complete sentences or complex sentences. So when we see something like a dependent clause by itself, we can do stuff to manipulate it to make it a complete sentence when you see that in your essay. And we'll go into compound sentences first. So here, when we're dealing with compound sentences, which is two independent clauses, two complete sentences, there are several ways that we can actually, fix. These are already fixed on their own, right? They're already by themselves. They're already sentences, and they're usually separated by a period. But if you want to combine sentences to combine, ideas in some cases, we can actually just, in one case, we can add a semicolon here. That's one case. We can add a semicolon to separate independent clauses to make an even longer sentence. Another way is adding what we call a coordinating conjunction. And here, we're separating two independent clauses with a comma splice plus a coordinating conjunction. And this coordinating conjunction can actually, words like and, but, however, while, and so forth. So if you want to look at a list of coordinating conjunctions, you can. And I'll go ahead and put that in the chat right now, what that portion is. Just so you guys can jot down the meaning, jot down the phrase so you guys can research that on your own. Coordinating conjunction. And the last one is what we call, on this side. The last one is called a conjunctive adverb. And I'll do that one too. I didn't involve them into the presentation. So here, to combine independent clauses, we can use conjunctive adverbs here. So we're separating it with the semicolon along with this word here, coordinating conjunction. So those are three ways that you can actually combine sentences to, combine ideas that should be attached when you're going through your essay. And then the next one we're going to go into, these are some examples. So here we have the cell was large, right? It's an independent clause. It's a complete sentence. It can be by itself. Here, it could attach to the molecule. This is also a whole sentence itself. Sometimes this is separated by a period, but in some cases you can go even further and just separate with the semicolon to make this an even larger sentence here. And then same thing with the next one. If we're going to separate sentences with coordinated conjunctions, we have the same sentence at the top. We can do either of these to make this even a longer sentence. Instead of having these short sentences when we're talking, when we're writing, we can add these things. So here we're adding coordinated conjunction here. The cell was large, but it could attach to the molecule. And then the next one is combining them with that adverb conjunctive. So here, the same thing, the cell was large, semicolon. However, it could attach to the molecule. There should be a comma there, but it could be, yeah, there has to be a comma right here, right after however. So again, we're using that adverb here to combine those two sentences together. So let's jot these three things down so we can separate independent clauses and so forth. And this is where this will be helpful when you see run-on sentences within your sentences, like your essay itself. If you identify those independent clauses and dependent clauses within your essay, you can see where, where those run-ons happen. And I'll explain how you can actually fix those run-ons in the next two slides, the last slide actually. And the next one is complex sentences, and this is where we're getting into independent clause plus dependent clause. So we have a complete sentence plus the dependent clause. Here, it actually kind of gets a little bit simple. If we see something like this, we can actually separate them with what we call a comma splice. So an example here, after it rains, we will go for a bike. So here, after it rains is a dependent clause, right? It's not a complete sentence. Here, we will go for a bike ride is an independent clause. It's a full sentence. So how do we combine those two things together? We just use a comma splice, which makes this whole thing a sentence itself, which is what we call a complex sentence. So after we combine them with the comma, it becomes a sentence, a complete sentence. And that's what we're looking for when we're going into editing. Here's another example. The bicycle is missing. This is independent, right? And then this side here is dependent, which was in the street. The bicycle is missing. Complete, which was in the street, is not complete. So we're just separating with the comma splice. And the last one, this one's a little tricky because we can actually fit dependent clauses within independent clauses themselves, and we're actually mix and matching them. So if you look at this, you see within the green, we have Pearl has won an art scholarship. That's a whole complete sentences. And then we have dependent clause, who danced so elegantly. That's a dependent clause. So we're actually putting the dependent clause within the dependent clause to make this a full complex sentence. So just keep that in mind as well, that we can actually do that. And then the last one we're going to go into is compound complex sentences. So mix and matching everything. So we have an independent clause plus a dependent clause plus another independent clause, a whole sentence. So I'm just going to give you one example with this one, just to see, just so I can elaborate more on this. So if we were to read this sentence here, this paragraph, young people who came of age during the progressive era years of 1910 to 1914 had grown up during a time of optimism and change, and they believe in a living wage for workers, reduced corporate power, and equitably distributed wealth. So if we were to color code this with independent versus dependent, this is how it would look like. And here, using that same rule from before where we actually fit the dependent clause within the independent clause, it's happening here. Here, I'll mark it here. So from this portion up to here, this is matching this here. So again, this is the same rules that we can actually put independent clauses within dependent clauses, which is what's happening here. So we can identify that when we're reading just the green, young people had grown up during a time of optimism and change. That's a complete sentence. who came of age during the progressive era years of 1910 to 1914. That's the dependent clause. So we're using that same rule from the previous slide within that portion there. And here we're just adding another independent clause here. And the way we're doing that, again, is going back to the first part with compound sentences. Since this here is now a complete sentence, this becomes an independent clause. So what do we do when we have two independent clauses? We separate it with a comma plus our coordinating conjunction. So this whole sentence here then becomes one complete sentence when we're dealing with compound complex sentences. So we can mix and match everything to make, to make even more bigger sentences and stuff like that. And this will help in identifying, areas that you see within your essay itself. So if you do not see anything within this portion here specifically, if you see like 3 independent clauses, in some cases like maybe 3 or 4, that is telling you that you have a run-on sentence. So this is as far as it can go, in my opinion. This is as far as it can go, unless we add lists and stuff like that. But as basic as we can get, this is as far as we can go when we're editing our paper. So if you see a lot of independent clauses attached within one sentence, there has to be something that we have to do. And identifying which is independent, which is dependent can help you, comma splice it or separate them with those coordinating conjunctions and stuff like that. So this is crucial when we're doing editing here. This is where we avoid those run-on sentences and stuff like that. All right, so now we went into grammar, and I don't have a slide for proofreading, but within proofreading, I'll just tell you, areas that you can actually consider when you're proofreading the final edits of your paper. And proofreading can actually go into maybe formatting. So let's say your instructor needs your paper in MLA formatting. That could be within proofreading itself. That's the final edits. Figuring out if it's MLA or APA, put in the format that it needs to be. And with spelling specifically, this is where you can go into those spelling errors. So looking at spelling, word choices, and stuff like that. And where can you use like italics and stuff like that within titles. Punctuations, we don't really need to go into punctuations. I think we all know how to use punctuations. How do you use quotes, periods, exclamation marks, question marks. I think we all know how to do those punctuations and stuff like that. So I'm not actually going to go into proofreading a lot. That's it actually with proofreading, is that we just got to check our final spelling, our formatting, and punctuation specifically. But if we were to look at this list here, these proofreading techniques, this is where I think is the most thing that you need to actually focus on, is the revision portion. This revision portion is crucial in how we, tell our story to people. It has to have that structure and organization attached to your story, how you're telling people about your story specifically. And one thing I actually just got into my head is within editing, your grammar portion within style and voice specifically. Let me stop sharing this. So within, what happened? Within styling and voicing, within grammar, we have to make sure we're talking in a specific language as well, in terms of first person, second person, and third person. So some essays actually require, some of them don't require some other languages, like narrative writing, for instance. Narrative writing can be written in first and third language, but it cannot actually be written in second, and so forth. So again, it goes back to that style portion again. There's different requirements for each style of writing, and that's the portion that, it will be overwhelming if we were to learn all of that within 1 hour of this webinar. But I hope you guys jotted down all of those techniques that I've showed you that you can actually consider when you're going into revision. So you have organization, you have your style, you have verb tenses, so make sure everything's in past, present, or future tense. We went into grammar, going into independent clauses, dependent clauses, complex, compound sentences, and so forth. Check all of your sentences. And then we went into voice and style within grammar. So we have informal versus informal voices, direct versus indirect, active versus passive. And then lastly, we went into proofreading. So checking your spelling and punctuation. So that those three things are actually the ones that you should consider when you're going to, start proofreading your essay. But again, when you proofread it entirely, you can actually just come to a tutor. Then we can go through it and then sort of explain some of those things in more detail. So if you guys have any questions, is there any questions out there? Oh. Yeah, tomorrow there is another session. There was for Daryl actually, the chat was actually, it should be within your Zoom window there somewhere. It should be at the bottom. And then we have a question saying, is there a session tomorrow? Yes, there is. The same time tomorrow from 2 to 3. And it'll be a duplicate session. It'll be the same thing that I explained here, but it's just for other students that couldn't make it to this session. But both of these sessions, today and tomorrow's, will be on our YouTube channel. So if you guys haven't seen our YouTube channel, I have all the past webinars are uploaded there and some other videos as well. So our YouTube channel is under the Net College Learning Center. So you can check that out as well. And then if there's no questions, if you guys want to schedule an appointment with the tutor, you can. You can go to My Net College within your student portal, your student tab, where you see all your bills, your grades, your schedule, and all of that stuff. At the very bottom there, you'll see Learning Center, and that's where you can actually find all of the information that we offer. That's where we're operating the Learning Center this semester. So you can schedule your appointment there with the tutor. You can schedule a group session. You can drop your essays within the proofreading drop box that we have there. We have links to our YouTube, our Facebook. We have great resources within some of these resources you see behind me. They're all available as PDF form on that website. So yeah. Yes, so tomorrow's webinar is starting at 2 o'clock again, 2 to 3 o'clock. All right, so I'm going to begin wrapping up this webinar. So again, my name is Quanah Yazzie. I'm one of 7 professional tutors, actually 6 now, 6 professional tutors here at Net College. I specialize in English and writing. So if you have questions, come see me, come email me. If you want, I'll be able to help you as much as I can. And yeah, so if there is not any more questions, let me just show you guys really quick, but here, there's questions involving, where do we send our papers on the Lawyer Web? So here, I'm gonna share my screen. So if you were to go to My Net College, right? And so let's just start from the Net College, actually, thenetcollege.edu. So here within the main web page, you see My Net College, and this is where you access everything, your personal records and stuff like that. So you're actually just gonna log in, and then within your Students tab here at the top, at the very bottom, you'll see Learning Center Resources. This is where I was explaining where we're operating from. So everything about the Learning Center is here for all sites at the Net College. You have links to our YouTube, our hours, tutor schedules, Winderock's new workshop series. Schedule your appointments here. This will direct you to a new scheduling software. Here you can schedule a tutor session. You can pick the tutor that you want as well. But here's where some questions are being asks is within this proofreading Dropbox. So here you can just submit your assignments from online, just submit it here. It'll open our Dropbox. And you can just submit your assignments, any type of assignments, an essay or research, or if you want proofreading on any writing assignments, you can just drop it here. Just choose your file. And once you submit, it'll submit to us, and then we distribute it to all the tutors here at the Net College. And then one of them will get back to you once they received it and once they've done a review and stuff like that. And here we have MLA formatting and citation guides, APA, and so forth. Then we have our tutors listed here as well, all the way through, and videos that are available. So that's our internal web pages here, and that's how we're operating this semester. All right, so that's it for this webinar. Thank you guys for joining us today. I really appreciate all who've attended, and I hope this was very informative for you guys. So if you have any questions, go ahead and just email me or email learningcenter@thenetcollege.edu. We'll get back to you as soon as we can. So with that, we'll go ahead and end this webinar. And yeah, thank you. Yeah.